Hi guys, and welcome back. So how do we actually start by creating a manifest? Well, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about it, and one of the easiest ways is to find the resource type that you're looking to create on your Kubernetes cluster, and then as you're scrolling through documentation, you're often going to come across these code snippets that are typically in YAML syntax instead of JSON syntax, and these code snippets are basically just going to show you how to create different types of resources on your Kubernetes cluster. Now, one of the most fundamental concepts in Kubernetes is just creating a pod. So you're going to see tons of examples of how to just create a standalone pod. But there's lots of other types of resources as well. So how can you kind of learn about all of the different types of core resources that are exposed by various Kubernetes API groups? Well, one of the ways that you can do that is to find the Kubernetes reference documentation. So on the left-hand side here of the documentation for Kubernetes, you're going to see that we've got this concept section here that talks about different types of workload types of resources. So you've got pods, you've got deployment controllers, replica sets, you've got jobs and cron jobs and things like that. But if you really want to see the actual core specification of all the different supported resources, the best way to do that is to find the API reference documentation, because this is essentially the contract that the Kubernetes clients like kubectl, for example, are going to make with the API server to ensure that resources have been properly defined inside of your Kubernetes manifest files. So if we open up the API reference documentation, this is kind of what it looks like here, and this is just generated directly off of the API specifications, which means that this is the authoritative reference documentation that allows you to define all of these different types of resources in Kubernetes that you see on the left-hand side here. Now keep in mind that this is not totally comprehensive of Kubernetes. So this is the Kubernetes core documentation for different resource types. However, if you install other add-ons into Kubernetes, they can actually create their own custom resource definitions, or CRDs, and those custom resource definitions allow you to deploy other types of resources into your cluster as well. But this reference documentation from the Kubernetes project itself is authoritative as far as just the core constructs of Kubernetes go. So just keep in mind that Kubernetes is extensible with other third-party custom resource definitions as well. So if you take a look at the resource definition for some of these different types of resources, it's going to show you the different fields or properties that you can specify on these resource definitions inside of your Kubernetes manifests. And as you look through different types of resources here, like stateful sets or pods or replica sets or deployment controllers, you're going to start to see a lot of common fields or common properties across these different types of Kubernetes resources. So number one, you're going to see this thing known as an API version. And so this allows you to specify which version of the API within Kubernetes that you want to use to deploy a particular resource. And I'm going to show you a way that you can actually determine what API versions are available on your cluster. The other common thing that you're going to see in resource definitions for Kubernetes manifest files is the kind property. And both API version and kind are what are known as root level properties. So they're not embedded under any other child properties. They're actually root level properties that appear at the top of your resource definitions. And so the API version and the kind together are basically going to determine which resource type it is that you are trying to deploy. There's lots of different API versions out there. There's lots of different resource types or kinds out there as well. And depending on which one you're attempting to deploy, that's going to determine what value you specify for each of these fields. Something else that you're going to see as a pretty common standard here is the metadata section. So all resources are going to have this metadata section. And if you take a look at the embedded object meta object that goes kind of underneath that metadata property, there's a whole bunch of different properties that you can define under there. However, the most common one is going to be the name property. So when you deploy a resource out to a Kubernetes cluster, it's going to have a given name so that in the future, if you were to redeploy a change to an existing resource, you can match up that resource using its existing name property, and therefore the cluster will basically look for a resource with that pre-existing name and then apply whatever updates there are that you've made in your manifest files. So that's going to be another really important property as well. And then most resources, I should say, are going to have this spec section here. So if you're deploying a deployment controller, if you're creating a pod, for example, if you're creating maybe something like a service controller down here that allows you to load balance your traffic, you're going to have this spec property that allows you to define the resource-specific properties for the given type of resource that you're deploying. So if you're deploying a service resource, then it's going to have certain properties like a cluster IP or an external name, or perhaps a load balancer class or load balancer IP and things like that. But those properties do not apply to other types of resources such as pods or deployment controllers or replica sets. So if you take a look at something like a pod and then drill into the pod spec definition, you're going to see that the properties that you can define at the pod layer are very different than what you're going to be able to specify for something like a service controller. So just keep in mind that that spec property is very important, because that's going to allow you to define the specific properties and values for different types of resources within your manifest files. And then this status property that you're going to see is fairly common across different types of resources as well. And if you have an existing resource on a Kubernetes cluster through the API server, and you retrieve the current configuration of that resource from the API server, the API server is actually going to return back this status property that tells you the status of the resource on the Kubernetes cluster. So that's not something that you would actually set. You can actually see that it is set to read only, indicating that when you're deploying a resource, you're not actually going to be changing the status, because the status is not something that you set on the cluster. The status is actually something that the cluster itself is going to kind of tell you when you retrieve the current status of a particular resource within the cluster. So how can we actually create one of these types of resources? So how do we actually define a resource inside of a manifest? Well, one option is going to be to retrieve an example or just kind of a template from the Kubernetes documentation. So you can go into, say, for example, the pod documentation here, and you can find one of these pod resources, and then you can simply copy the existing sample that they have here, and then you can bring it over into your text editor of choice. And I'm going to change this to YAML and just paste that in, and then you can kind of use this existing template and start to customize certain things about it. So they've already defined for you things like the API version and the type of resource, also known as the kind property here. But under the metadata section here, this is where you can start to customize things and say, well, I want this pod that I want to deploy to my cluster to be named something like my cool web app, for example. So now we're starting to actually customize this manifest file and plug in some of our own unique values into this manifest configuration. And then down here under the spec section, you can start to customize some of the different values for the pod specification. Now, what you're going to start to notice in these example-driven scenarios is that this does not account for all of the different configuration options available on a pod. This is really just showing me kind of a stripped-down, bare-bones minimum example to deploy a very basic pod configuration. But if I have a more advanced need for things like volume mounts in a pod, for example, or other advanced networking configurations or anything like that that I might want to define at the pod level, this example here is not really showing me all of the different possibilities, all the different properties under spec that I could potentially be using. And this is where the reference documentation really comes into play, because the reference documentation is going to show me all of the supported properties under spec, not just the containers subproperty that allows me me to define one or more containers within my pod spec. So anytime that you are deploying a particular type of resource, it really benefits you to take a look at the authoritative reference documentation and then drill into that particular resource type's documentation, and then find that spec section here, go into the pod spec, for example, here, or service spec or deployment spec or whatever type of resource it is you're trying to deploy, and then look at all of the different properties that are going to be supported for that particular type of resource. So when we copied that example from the documentation, we only had the containers child property under the pod spec. However, you can see that there are a lot of other properties that we could potentially define on a pod configuration when we deploy it out to the cluster. So if you're kind of trying to figure out what's possible with a particular type of resource, the reference documentation is going to show you the properties that you can define. It's also going to tell you which properties are mandatory, so which properties you have to define. And it's also going to give you some guidance in terms of what each of those properties actually customizes. So for example, in this case here, we've got the containers property, and it's telling us that the containers property on a pod spec has a list of the containers that belong to the pod. And the reference documentation is also going to give you further insights as well. So for example, look at the very next sentence. It tells you that the containers property cannot currently be added or removed. And so what it's saying is that this property can't be updated. We can't add or remove containers to the array of containers for an existing pod. So if you have an existing pod with a name like My Cool Web App, and you only define a single container inside of that pod, if I came along later on and tried to define a second container with a different configuration inside the same pod, and then tried to deploy that out to my cluster, we would actually get an error because the pod resource type does not allow the containers property to be updated for an existing pod. So what you'd actually have to do in this case is delete the pod with the metadata name here. So I'd have to delete the pod named My Cool Web App, and then I'd have to recreate the pod with the new container configuration, because we cannot add or remove containers from the pod configuration once it's already been created on the API server. So that's kind of just an introduction to how to define a resource type, how to figure out what supported properties there are on each specific type of resource, and then figuring out what each of those properties actually does in terms of configuring that particular resource. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.